All right, we're going to get started. First of all, thank you all for joining. We ran into some technical difficulties, but we have persevered. So we're really pleased to have Laura Chenven with us today. Laura is an educator by trade and a board member of the Mid-Hudson Anti-Slavery History Project, a public history organization that conducts research and programming on enslavement and abolition in New York State. She works with the O Freedom Quilting Project, sharing local history that provides inspiration and content for the commemorative quilts created by community organizations. She also works with interns from Vassar College and Marist University on local story maps, walking tours, and research. In today's presentation, we're honoring Black History Month. Thank you, Laura, for joining us. Take it away.
Okay, well, give me a second to share my screen and do it the right way. Here we go. Share. Oops. Somehow that didn't work. Where is it? You don't want to see my background. Hold on. I'm going to find my PowerPoint. All right, I'm going to stop share for a minute and start it over. Okay. Share screen. Share. There we go. Nope. Wow. I just was doing it a second ago. All right, let me pull this up first. Stop share. I'm really sorry, folks. This was definitely happening about 5 minutes ago, so I don't know why it's not working now. So share my screen. There. Now you can see it. Now let me make it all. You can all see my screen now? Are you able to see
the we can see it, Laura.
Okay, terrific. Thank you. So anyway, I'm so delighted to be talking with all of you this evening. Sorry, oops. Darn. Nope. Nope. I'll do it again and I will do it better this time. Share my screen. Share. There. Okay, good. Anyway, I'm delighted to be here. And on behalf of the Mid-Hudson Anti-Slavery History Project. And this evening, we're going to take a look at the changes and challenges that were facing Black men and women, enslaved and free, in the Hudson Valley, with a focus on Dutchess County in the period leading up to and including the Revolutionary American Revolution. During the 18th century, as some of you may know.
Move your phone a little bit.
Excuse me? Somebody. Yes? Okay, I'll continue. During the 18th century, enslavement in Dutchess County was reaching its peak. Quakers in the eastern part of the county were calling for an end to enslavement, while enslaved men and women were taking freedom into their hands by running away. And then during the American Revolution, the chaos of war and the need for fighting and support troops provided new opportunities for Black Americans to seek and sometimes achieve emancipation. Okay, now it should be going to the next one, but it's not working. Okay, here we go. So we're going to be looking at 3 aspects of emancipation. Self-emancipation, the Quakers' role in emancipation, and the revolution and the quest for freedom. So the first thing I want to just talk about is our commitment to studying history. And if you've been following the news over the last 2 weeks, the federal government took down signage in many places, but in particular, I'm thinking about Pennsylvania, in Philadelphia, that discussed Washington's role as an enslaver. But this is really not controversial history. I think we all know that Washington enslaved people. But he also did change his mind ultimately, and he did make provisions, unlike Jefferson, to free the people he held in bondage after his death. And Dutchess County was both a center of enslavement in the North, but also an important center of anti-slavery. And we can celebrate our abolition heroes, both black and white, only by understanding how courageous they were and how they fought against a system of oppression that had been embedded in our region for 200 years. And so that's the perspective that we want to address today. Okay, let's move it forward. Return, no. Oh, why is it not moving? There we, okay, no. Keep going. All right, I think I'm gonna have to do this a little bit different. Oh, I'm gonna do it this way. It's kind of, I'm gonna do it this way because it's not advancing properly. So I'm gonna just do this. All right, now. Okay, no, still not working properly. There we go. I'm sorry about that. Make it a little bigger. Okay, so let's start at the very beginning. The first enslaved Africans were brought to New Amsterdam in New York in 1627, and it would take another 200 years before New York State finally abolished chattel slavery. And even then, some people were held in bondage until the 1840s. The British took over the colony in 1664, renaming it New York, as we know, and they made a system that had been started by the Dutch even harsher. So after a slave uprising in New York City in 1712, restrictions were placed on all Black New Yorkers, enslaved and free. For example, it made it illegal to gather in groups larger than 3. It was prohibited for Black people to carry a cane or a stick or own a gun, and death was certain if you assaulted or murdered a white person. What was Black labor like in New York? So as I mentioned before, New York was the center of Northern slavery. It had the largest number of enslaved people north of Maryland, and the largest concentration in New York State was in the Hudson Valley from New York City, including Brooklyn, up to Albany. And slavery was so prevalent in the river port towns of Fishkill, Poughkeepsie, Rhinebeck, that by the late 1700s, 1 out of every 4 or 5 white households in those cities enslaved at least one person. I'll have to tell you, when I learned that, I found that quite shocking. So, slavery in the early Hudson Valley. Dutchess County was established in 1683 as one of the first counties in New York State. And rich families began to move in and built these large estates, some of which you still see along the river. What's interesting is that many tenant farmers who rented land from these rich landowners also used enslaved people to produce the goods they provided as a requirement of their tenancy. So this slide actually takes a look at the numbers of this is in 1790, which is after the revolution, but it's the first census of the new America. And it gives us some really good data. You'll see later, we'll talk about why these numbers are probably less than they were before the revolution. But Fishkill had 593 enslaved people recorded, Rhinebeck 404, Poughkeepsie 201, and actually, much to my surprise, Clinton had 174. Clinton was the 4th largest concentration of enslaved people within Dutchess County per jurisdiction. And it was very interesting to me as I was doing the research on this. It struck me that there was of the people who were enslavers in Clinton, many of them owned more than one or two enslaved people. Unlike Poughkeepsie, where almost all of the enslavers really had one or two people, not really more. So that's interesting. So let's take a look at whoops. This is okay. Some of the names. So the people who enslaved a lot of people, the Stoutenburg family was at the top of the list. Between the various people in the Stoutenburg family that lived in Clinton, they held 20 people. The Bard family, which didn't really come into Clinton until 1800, even by 1810, they held 12 people. John DeWitt is listed as a single person, held 9 people. William Barber, 8 people. Cornelius Radcliffe, 6. So I said, well, this is a sampling of some of the larger enslavers. But here we have a list, and there are many, many more of these. And I just picked out a few. John Allen, 1 person. Anthony Badgley, 1. John Bailey, 1. John Berg, 5. John Crabson Sr., 4, Richard Decantling, 5. And I picked out George Elvin because my family had a house in Stanfordville, and we always used to go to Elvin's Market. So I'm curious whether that is from the same family. It just struck me as amusing. So at this point, let's just talk a little bit about, words that we use. And this has been something important, vocabulary. How do we talk about people who were enslaved and people who we've called slave owners in the past? And we've changed this a lot. So we try to talk about enslaved men and women, not slaves, because these were human beings. And while they were enslaved, they did have other aspects of their lives. They loved, they had families, they did work, and they shared and saved some of their own culture. They had individual lives, religions, cultures, dreams. And we also use the term enslaver rather than owner, because on the principle that no human being can be owned. Then also, when we've talked in the past about fugitive slaves, that somehow legitimizes that they're running away from some legality. So we prefer to call them freedom seekers. Now, I will say that this change of vocabulary sometimes gets confusing, and I'm very happy if I make a mistake to be corrected. So the other thing that's very important to know is that people actually didn't become enslaved until they reached the New World. Prior to that, they were captured Africans, and they resisted from the very beginning. And about 1 in 10 ships that came across the Atlantic to the New World experienced some kind of a rebellion by these captured Africans, which very often resulted in death, people being thrown overboard. But clearly, people, the striving for freedom, which we do talk about in this period of Freedom 2020, of Rev 250, is there for all human beings, I think. So the first aspect of self-emancipation that we're going to talk about, the first aspect of emancipation is self-emancipation. And you've seen this, I think you used this this picture on your advertisement. This move towards self-emancipation, it sparked a movement that helped freedom seekers. And I will also say that we have a bunch of wonderful resources here that we've gotten a lot of information from. So what you see in front of you is a fantastic book, In Defiance. It was written by our colleagues Susan Stesson-Cohen and Ashley Hurlburt Biagini. And they've been able to collect over 900 advertisements just between New York City and between Westchester and Albany itself. So one of the things, as we talk about freedom seekers and Underground Railroad, et cetera, it's so important to know that people were running away from right here. There's also another book that was published by Graham Russell Hodges, One Pretends to Be Free. And that's another very, very good resource. So let's talk a little bit about what some of these advertisements say. I want to take the example of a man named Tom from Poughkeepsie. He attempted escape 3 times. The first ad is in 1755, and it was printed in the New York Gazette. And it notes he ran away from the heirs of a Baron Van Cleek in Poughkeepsie. He was described as a mulatto-colored man slave, pock-broken, about 5 feet 10 inches high, a well-set, likely fellow. He plays on the violin and can read and write. Perhaps he may have a false pass. And it goes on to describe him and talk about that he took a horse. And then it ends, it says, whoever takes up said Negro and brings him to Poughkeepsie, or secures him in jail and gives notice thereof to Leonard Van Cleek or Mydert Vale of Dutchess County shall receive £5 reward and reasonable charges. So that's the first ad. Well, not much later than that, in June of 1755, this time, there's an ad that says he ran away from Joseph Harris of Beekman. And we have some more information now about Tom. He's not only literate in English, he's also literate in Dutch, and he can also do math. Now, we now know a lot about Tom. He's a skilled and educated worker. His first enslaver had recently died, and perhaps creating an opportunity for escape. The man is of mixed race. He has the capacity to forge his own pass, but it looks like he had been found and was sold to somebody else. Aha, now there's a third ad. This time this ad is in 1755. And Tom is listed as having run away in 1756. Now that's kind of weird. How come they waited a whole year to advertise for Tom? Again, from the same guy, Harris. Well, we find out from the ad, it turns out he'd been recently seen with British forces near Albany. And then it says it's likely he's in Boston or other parts of New England. Now, the dates are during the French and Indian War, at a time when the Massachusetts troops were in upper New York. War in its crisis and its disorganization of civil society does create opportunities for those seeking freedom, as it did very much so during the Revolutionary War. But one thing we can say for certain is that Tom used his skills to escape, and education to escape, not once but 3 times. And we don't see any more ads for him. We certainly hope that he made it to safety and stayed free. Now, these self-emancipations, as you can see from the dates, came long before what we know as the Underground Railroad. The Underground Railroad is generally dated to begin around 1830, well after freedom seekers were flying to freedom. And so, we call, and I give Peter Bunton the credit for this, the Underground before the Railroad. And it was these efforts that had a great influence on the development of the anti-slavery movement in the period leading up to and during the Revolution. So let's talk about the Enlightenment and the question of enslavement. The language of revolution, equality, freedom, it emerged from the Enlightenment in the period basically between the late 1600s and the late 1700s. And it emphasized rational thought, and its ideas had a tremendous effect on the movement to end enslavement. By the mid-1700s, colonial society here in the Americas began a serious question of the morality of the system of enslavement. But a major barrier to acting on these questions was the immense profitability of the system, both in the South and in the North. But this influenced the Quakers a great deal. And our next question of, or aspect of emancipation is Quakers. While Quakers were often insular and involved with change in morality within their own circles. Their early and consistent questioning of morality and the rightness of enslaving other human beings had a considerable impact on a number of anti-slavery efforts, not only within their own circles, but ultimately within Dutchess County and New York State as a whole. I want to cite a really excellent new book that I've been reading by Sarah Groening-Sater. And some of you may have seen her at Nine Partners. She did a very, very good presentation there that was, I think it was the Millbrook Historical Society that sponsored it. It's on YouTube. Her new book is called The Rising Generation, and she documents how the Quaker experience of gradual abolition in their own communities impacted the post-revolutionary movement of gradual abolition laws in New York State. If you have a chance to read it, it's just one of the best books on this topic I've read in a really long time. And she's also a legal historian as well as a general historian. In the late 1600s, Quakers began to move into Dutchess County from New England and then from New York, from Long Island and New York City. And then in the early 1700s, they began to move into the Oblong, which, as you know, is the narrow strip along Connecticut. Their passage as a community from profiting from the slave trade, transporting and selling of slave-made goods, and being enslavers themselves, to finally turning their backs on these practices took a long time. Their actions marked the second aspect of emancipation leading up to and during the revolutionary period that we're talking about today. And it took more than 100 years for this to, let's go forward. No. Oh, geez. I don't know why this is not working the way it's supposed to. There we go. Okay. So one of the first organized anti-slavery movements began in the Philadelphia communities of the Philadelphia community. And I just love this flyer, which is dated from 1737. It says, "All slave keepers that keep the innocent in bondage, apostates." This was really radical for the time. And I just, it's fun. Anyway, this movement grew continuously into the 1700s, and that brings us to John Woolman and Anthony Benezet, who were very important not only in Pennsylvania but also in the Hudson Valley. So there was this increasing concern up in New York, and New York was not far behind Pennsylvania in raising these issues of the morality of enslavement. And ultimately, the Oblong meeting in Dutchess County became the fulcrum for activity for this struggle within the New York Quaker community. But in the 1740s, John Woolman in Philadelphia began his public opposition to the system of enslavement. And in 1754, he published an article against slavery, not only around Quakers, but also calling on all Christians to oppose the practice. He did travel widely, including to the Hudson Valley, where his ideas really started to take hold. And he had a very important impact on Anthony Benezet, who took a strong stand against the buying and selling of enslaved people. First, working to convince the Philadelphia Quakers, his teaching spread to New Jersey, Lower New York, Westchester, and then up into this area. His goal was to end enslavement, but he also understood that a gradual path would be more successful than the call for immediate manumission. He saw a restriction on buying and selling as a first step to that end. And as more restrictions were proposed, including possible banishment for those who refused to follow the strictures, there were Quakers who already held enslaved people, and they increased their opposition to this. But his efforts were ultimately successful, and the Quakers' gradual abolition approach to abolition had an important influence in what ultimately became New York's gradual abolition laws. But let's go back and take a look at the Oblong. I'm sure most of you are really familiar with this, but in 1767, well, first of all, the oblong meeting was started in 1742, and as the Quaker population grew, it was followed by so many of the other Quaker meetings on the other side, Nine Partners, Creek, Oswego, Elbow, Stanford, and not necessarily in that order. And Eastern Dutchess was becoming the largest Quaker populated area outside of Philadelphia. Oblong was connected to the Purchase meeting, which had been established in 1725. And then when Purchase became a quarterly meeting, it had oversight of the oblong. Purchase also regularly met at the oblong for the quarterly meetings. And in April of 1767, the oblong drafted its famous query asking, isn't slavery a harm to both the slave and the owner? Doesn't slavery deny the slave freedom to obey his or her inner light? Should Quakers buy, sell, or own slaves? Should Quakers free their existing slaves? And how can we be diligent Quakers and maintain slavery? So they sent this to Purchase, and Purchase said, this is going to stir up trouble. And so they refused to take direct action on it, but they did forward it to the New York meeting. But New York meeting also said, we'll table this for a while. However, neither the hesitancy of Purchase or Flushing stopped the oblong. And then together with Nine Partners, they decided to begin acting on these principles. And for example, they started banishing some members for buying enslaved people and gave ultimatums to some other enslavers who had not manumitted folks. So let's take a look at the New York yearly meeting. And you can see as we get into the Revolutionary period, which was very, very hard for Quakers because there were all these issues around being accused of being loyalists and their pacifism, etc. But things still continued in this period. So in 1775, the New York Yearly Meeting declared that no Quaker should enslave anyone. And it said that those who did not restore enslaved people to their natural right as to liberty ought to restore them as soon as they arrive at a suitable age for freedom, which was generally considered adulthood, or you could take care of yourself. And then in 1778, they said, quote, the matter respecting those friends that continue to hold slaves being now taken under consideration, it is the judgment of the meeting that such friends as still refuse to free them are to be dealt with as disorderly members. And then they went further in 1781, because they said, now we have to sort of make sure that the people we're manumitting are okay, that they're taken care of. And so in 1781, New York monthly meetings were directed to visit the homes of those who had been formerly enslaved to ensure that they were well cared for, both spiritually and physically. We probably could spend a lot of time talking about the answers they got. They were very interesting, but mostly people were pleased that they were no longer enslaved. So another thing that was very, very important that was happening here, and the Quakers really took an early stand on this, is the question of education. And so meetings were directed to see that groups of Quakers could establish schools that would be financed by the local monthly meetings. This practice was extremely important, and Sarah Groening-Sater's book also talks about this, as a way to prepare Black youth for labor and for skilled labor and for literacy. And all of that also meant for participation in society as a whole. And it contributed to the development of Black leadership in the anti-slavery movement. Also the early development of a Black intelligentsia in New York that came into its own in the early 19th century. And these early manumissions of enslaved Black men actually helped contribute to New York being the state with the largest number of Black voters in the Revolutionary period, something that became increasingly important and debated and struggled around in the years leading up to the Civil War. Oops, nope, here we go. Now, One of the topics that is really, I think, really needs a lot more study is the issue of the manumission of enslaved people and what happened to them post manumission. And here's the Quaker record here is really invaluable because, as many of you know, Quakers had meetings, they took notes, they preserved them. And thus, starting in the 18th century, we can find lists of manumissions began to be consistently noted in Quaker meeting records. And I just want to give a shout out to Cynthia Koch, who's here. She's wrote a really, really important essay, in my opinion, that includes information on many things, but including on the manumission of people who were enslaved by members of both the Creek and Nine Partners meetings. And she also notes members who was disowned for not manumitting the people they enslaved. And that's something that I think is really interesting because the NESRI, which is the Northeast Slave Record Index, a wonderful site if you like to go down interesting rabbit holes, has lists of the names of people who were enslavers and the names of the people they enslaved. And it's interesting that in the area of Nine Partners, there are a number of people who are listed as owning enslaved people in 1790, 1800, even 1810, and they have some names that are known to be Quaker names. So it would be very interesting to sort of compare the names that Cynthia's listed and see whether or not there's a connection from some of the people who were disowned and continue to enslave others. So it took the New York Friends close to a century to end the practice of enslavement in their own communities, but their actions put the movement for emancipation in a new light and really was a tremendous contribution. So let's take a look at the third aspect, which is the American Revolution, and really ask the question, freedom for whom? So it wasn't only the Quakers who were struggling with Enlightenment ideas. These ideas had taken hold of colonials throughout England's American empire. The hope for liberty from oppression was on the lips of many, but there was no agreement about who would benefit from that liberty and what, if anything, that liberty might mean to enslaved Black people. Most of the people who signed the Declaration of Independence and later the Constitution were enslavers. But crazy as it may seem, many of them were actually philosophically opposed to slavery, and sometimes even activists in the anti-slavery movement. So let's take a look at two New Yorkers that are of note, John Jay and James Talmadge Jr. They're a little bit of generation apart, but I think it's both interesting. So John Jay of Westchester County, his father had been an investor in at least 11 slave ships, making the family among New York's most elite. But Jay was a great patriot. He was a signatory of the Treaty of Paris, a founding father, the country's first Chief Justice, and a governor of New York, under whom the state passed its first gradual abolition law in 1799. He was also a founder of New York's Manumission Society. But by 1800, we're talking about after the Revolution, he still was the enslaver of at least 5 people. And even in 1810, he still held one person as enslaved in his household. James Talmadge Jr. from Stanford, quite local in Dutchess County, was from a family who played a very important role during the Revolution. But Talmadge's father had been in the company of volunteers. He actually led a company of volunteers who were involved in the capture of General Burgoyne. But their family wealth was also a product of the system of slavery. James Jr., on the other hand, was a passionate abolitionist. And while at Brown, he was a commencement speaker, and he gave a published, very famous, strong abolitionist commencement speech in 1798. He became a representative to Congress in 1817, and he introduced the Talmadge Amendment, which would have restricted enslavement in the Missouri Territory. But it was defeated, and pro-slavery forces blamed him for promoting disunion. And he replied, quote, If dissolution of the Union must take place, let it be so. If civil war, which gentlemen so much threaten, must come, I can only say, let it come. However, he himself may have been an enslaver prior to his election in Congress. But both Jay and Talmadge were local heroes from patriot families in the struggle to end enslavement in New York and across the United States. But they and their families benefited from the profits of slavery. History is very complicated. Now, let's take a look at the American Revolution and its impact on enslavement and freedom for people of African descent. So I know when I went to school, we didn't know about anybody who was Black who fought in the war except Crispus Attucks. And even today, you'd be hard pressed to learn much about the role of Black people in the war. One of the people who started talking about this was a man named a scholar named Benjamin Quarles, who wrote The Negro in the American Revolution in 1961. And he was one of the first to recognize and quantify the impact of the war on the Black population. And today, a little more than half a century after his work, a leading trend in historical interpretation is the recognition that the revolution had a profound effect on enslavement as an institution. Historian Alan Gilbert describes the war as the story of two revolutions, by which he means the British against the colonists and enslaved Blacks against their enslavers. The war offered new opportunities for the enslaved that included fighting for the British or for the Americans, sometimes in exchange for freedom. But the chaos of war often also opened up the way for enslaved men and women to simply run away and find a new place to live and try to start a new life. At the start of the American Revolution, there were approximately 450,000 people enslaved within the 13 colonies. And some historians estimate that as many as 80 to 100,000 enslaved men and women throughout the colonies escaped. And while many died in battle from disease or were even re-enslaved, thousands also changed their status in a variety of ways. I'm not there yet. So, enslaved people were taking sides, but overall, were they loyalists or patriots? Overall, they were trying to figure out which side gives me the greatest opportunity for freedom. And after the war started, barely 6 months after the war started, these people who were seeking freedom got a push emanating from 600 miles away in Virginia. And we're going to talk about the Dunmore Proclamation. In 1775, John Murray, Lord Dunmore, who was the royal governor of Virginia, was facing problems on all sides. There was a shortage of fighting men. There was not enough naval power. He had a radical plan, which he hoped would give his army what it needed. His proclamation, which was issued on November 7th of 1775, called on all enslaved people who were able to assist the defense of the British cause, and in exchange, they would get their freedom, with a caveat, as long as they were people enslaved by the patriots. If they were enslaved by the loyalists, nope, they would not get their freedom. The Declaration did not apply to them. And although this was focused on Virginia, the proclamation was heard everywhere. And soon this policy was adopted in locations around the colonies. And its impact on the patriots was enormous. It was clear that not only was this proclamation aimed at recruiting Black support, but also disrupting the economies of the patriots. If the slaveholders lost substantial percentages of their workforce, it would interfere with their ability to produce goods and sustain their rebellion. So let's see what happened here. So newspaper advertisements that we have been looking at, we start to see some impact of that. So in 1776, It's not printed on here, but I'll just read it to you. James Horton of Rye announced the loss of his enslaved man, Will. He ended the advertisement with the caution that it is thought he will endeavor to get on a man of war or go to the king's forces. But freedom seekers across the northern states heeded the call. And here's an interesting ad that specifically mentions Dunmore in 1776. It states that this man named Cuff Dix has escaped and notes that enslaved people in general think that Lord Dunmore is contending for their liberty, and it is not improbable that he is on the march to join his lordship's own black regiment. So this proclamation was not a complete overthrow of the social order of enslavement, but with tens of thousands of Black people moving across enslavement boundaries, it certainly created a dent in the social order of the day. However, there were some interesting unintended consequences. So Dunmore's tactic also had the consequences of unifying white Southern slave owners, both against the British and for the property rights of slaveholders. One South Carolina politician, Edward Rutledge, wrote that arming freed slaves tended, quote, more effectually to work an eternal separation between Great Britain and the colonies than any other expedient which could possibly have been thought of. Particularly incensed was George Washington, who called Dunmore an arch traitor. So during the Revolution, close to 30,000 Black men served in the Loyalists or colonial armies, about 20,000 on the Loyalist side, and between 5,000 and 8,000 on the colonial side. And they were used, Black fighters troops were used as both support and support battalions and fighters. Although this changed from time to time as military leaders wavered between needing troops and worrying about arming Black men and how these men would also be received by white conscripts. Women were also served on both sides, working as nurses, spies, cooks, and other support positions. And there were other unintended consequences. After the proclamation was made, the Virginia Congress responded by threatening the death penalty to people who were escaping enslavement. So now we come to New York, the Philipsburg Proclamation. So in June of 1799, the British General Sir Henry Clinton took the Dunmore Proclamation a step further. He was headquartered in New York, and he was very frustrated by the lack of troops that he needed to support a series of battles along the Hudson River. He saw the value of conscripting both enslaved and free Black people, and this would simultaneously provide manpower for his army while disrupting the Hudson Valley economy through a significant reduction of the regional labor force. So he expanded the Dunmore Proclamation in two ways. And this was issued, by the way, in Phillips Manor Hall, which is down in Westchester, in Yonkers. So his proclamation had two significant parts. First, to stem the Black participation in the Continental Army by proclaiming that any enslaved or formerly enslaved Black person captured in battle would be turned in for a bounty and then re-enslaved. But the second and most significant part of the proclamation promised freedom to any enslaved person of an American rebel who went over to the British side. This provision was understood to include women, children, and men who were too old or otherwise unable to fight, and it applied to all the colonies, not just New York, whereas Dunmore's had been mostly about Virginia. Now you could have whole families fleeing to the British lines, but it was also a very difficult choice to make with consequences that could be very dangerous. Nonetheless, the draw of freedom was great, and the proclamation led to the largest disruption of the system of enslavement of its time. But like the Dunmore Proclamation, this new one did not apply to people who were enslaved by the British Loyalists. Their rights were protected by the Crown. As one historian, Nick Atkinson, wrote, The governor intended to crush a rebellion, not reconfigure the social order. So, what about freedom seekers after the Phillipsburg Proclamation? So I have two advertisements here that are local. So a man named Pomp ran away in 1779 from his enslaver, Comfort Sands, and there's a description of him. And one of the things it says at the end is, he is harbored by some disaffected people, and it is likely he means to go to the enemy. And then you have Job Dick, who ran away from Job Mulford of Statsburg. And he did this advertisement on him, and it said, among other things, describing him, it says, it is likely he will offer, it's likely he will offer to enter on board some vessel or go to sea or attempt to get within the enemy's lines. All masters of vessels are cautioned against carrying him off, and those who live near the Sound are desired to prevent his going to Long Island. There were a lot of British on Long Island. So what happened to those who left for the loyal side? And I'm sure many of you have already seen Ken Burns' really excellent series on the Revolution. And you'll know that many people died of disease or in battle. But some were re-enslaved after the war. But some ended up in Canada. So I thought this was fascinating. So after the war, the colonial forces, now the United States, wanted the British to return property. And this is an excerpt from a letter that went from George Washington to General Guy Carleton about returning enslaved people who had been freed by the British. So this is George Washington, and my voice is deep because I have a cold, so maybe I'll sound like him. I was surprised to hear you mention that an embarkation had already taken place in which a large number of Negroes had been carried away. I cannot conceal from your excellency that my private opinion is that the measure is totally different from the letter and spirit of the treaty. I find it my duty to signify my readiness in conjunction with your excellency to enter into any agreement or take any measures which may be deemed expedient to prevent the future carrying away of any Negroes or other property of the American inhabitants. So, what happened? So let's take so a few days after that, Carleton replied that he was obliged to keep the promises that were made by his predecessor, Dunmore and Clinton, to bestow freedom on those who served for the British. But he did agree to share with the United States the names of the Black men and women who were transported from the United States to Canada with the retreating Loyalist forces. And it included Black people who remained enslaved to the Loyalists, as well as those who were free as a result of the Dunmore and Phillipsburg proclamations. And that book was called The Book of Negroes. And it is a list of 3,000 individuals, which included men, women, and children, some free, some enslaved. And so I took a look at it and I thought, let's just take a look at some of the people listed there. One of them was someone named Joseph Odell, who was recorded as Joe in the Book of Negroes, and he was described as a fine boy of just 14 years of age. He was listed as the property of Daniel Odell, a loyalist from Beekman in Dutchess County, a tenant farmer and rent collector on the Livingston estate. And of course, you know, the Livingtons owned a lot of property. He remained enslaved because his enslaver was a loyalist. But interestingly, I found this someplace else. 10 years later, when Joseph was 24, he was noted in the Royal Gazette and Nova Scotia Advertiser as a runaway from his enslaver in Canada. So now we have John Simonsbury. He was aged 43, was from Fredericksburg in Dutchess County. His former owners were Charles Collins and Alphonse Palmer. And it's noted that his flight was as a result of the Phillipsburg Proclamation in 1779. Thought that was interesting. Now we have a Robert, age 36, from 9 Partners, listed as a former slave who ran off in 1781, former owner Isaac Conklin, but also noted that he has a current owner, Bartholomew Cronell. He did not have a birth certificate. Now, a birth certificate was basically a certificate proving your freedom, and it was given to people who had run away from patriots by a General Birch in the British Army. So it's possible he had been re-enslaved by the British. Then we have Lydia Johnson, who was 30, also from 9 Partners, ran off in 1780. She does have a birth certificate. Her former enslaver was John Barner. And then we have Nanny, 35, from 9 Partners also, ran off in 1776, has a birth certificate, former owner, Austin Graham. So, Black men in the Continental Army. When we look at these advertisements for freedom seekers, not all fled to the British side. Some men were fleeing to the colonial side too. So Job ran away from his enslaver, a William Davenport, who lived close to West Point. And 4 years after he escaped to join the Continental Army, Davenport advertises to get him back. Another example, there was also this changing attitudes of the Continental Army to Black recruits. Among arming enslaved men, as I mentioned before, was not palatable to many whites who were already worried about rebellion and insurrection. But on the other hand, the constant need to buttress the existing ranks of the Continental Army meant there was going to be continued pressure to recruit Black men. In 1775, at the beginning of the Revolution, General Washington banned Black men from serving in the Continental Army. But by the time of his ban, many had already enlisted and were serving. And for the most part, once Black men were recruited into the Continental Army, they were not removed from their military posts. And several of their commanders were very strong supporters of them. And the need for fighting forces made the participation of Black men essential. And less than a year after his initial ban, Washington changed his orders and left it to the regimental commanders to decide whether or not they would take Black men, both enslaved and free, into the army. And the conditions, were varied. So enslavers were permitted to fulfill their own mandatory military service by substituting enslaved men. Some of the enslaved men who were promised freedom when they fulfilled their time of service and were promised freedom, and some were freed outright before joining the Continental Army. After the war, and I thought this was interesting, because Black men were paid for their service during the war. They gave their pensions and enlistment bounties and salaries to their former masters to buy their freedom. And others, all after the war, were actually re-enslaved. This is another interesting thing, and I'd like to know more about it, but on March 20th, 1781, New York passed a law that promised enslavers free land. And according to one of the sites of National Park Service, 500 acres in exchange for allowing men they enslaved to serve in the Continental Army for 3 years or until regularly discharged. And for this service, the enslaved men would be granted freedom. So overall, the Continental Army was integrated. Black, white, and Native soldiers often fought together. The American Army did not segregate its soldiers until the War of 1812, but segregation remained in place in the U.S. Army until 1947. Now, do I still have time? I know we're kind of getting a little late here, but stop me if I need to. I'll continue. I've a little bit more to go. So I wanted to talk about Hercules Sherman as an example of, there's a couple of examples of the experience of Black men in the Continental Army. What was it like to be a soldier? And Hercules Sherman was born in Westchester. He was enslaved in Orange County, then later in New Jersey, then came to live on the east side of the Hudson in what now would be Putnam County, but at the time was Dutchess County. And he's a good example of the complicated and conflicting treatment that the enslaved and formerly enslaved people faced during the Revolution. So Sherman was born in Yonkers, but by the beginning of the Revolutionary War, he was enslaved by a man named Jonathan Archer in Orange County. He believed his enslaver was a loyalist, so as an act of rebellion against him, when he was approached by a group of men whom he thought was serving in the Continental Army, he helped them find a location they were looking for. Well, it turned out that group was actually a band of deserters from the Continental Army, and Sherman was soon approached by a Captain Crane, who was on the Patriot side, and he got taken into custody for assisting deserters. Well, to prove his loyalty to the Patriot cause, Sherman guided Captain Crane to where these deserters had been, and the deserters were captured. And then he was recruited by the captain to serve in the company and was promised freedom as a reward. So he had a pension application, and it notes his service as a scout near Fort Montgomery on the Hudson Valley, marching with regiments against the British in Springfield, Massachusetts. And he was, according to the records, he was given both discharge and freedom papers from the Continental Army at the end of the war. But when he presented these papers to his former employer, the guy ripped him up and re-enslaved him. He was then sold several times until 1795, by which time he had managed to save enough to purchase his freedom from his final enslaver of Francis Price, who was in New Jersey. He then took his family, like I mentioned, to the east side of the Hudson River, and you see in the census of 1800, he's listed as head of household. And this is a copy of his manumission papers. But anyway, years later, when he applied for a pension, and despite corroborating evidence from other witnesses, his application was denied. This was a man born enslaved who persisted in his quest for freedom for approximately 25 years. And after all that time, he still had to purchase his own freedom. And even after that, he was denied his rightful pension by the U.S. government. Now I want to talk about two other Revolutionary War heroes that are local, who did eventually get their pension. One of them is Anthony Waring. This is from a lake, Tones Pond, which is just north of Brewster, now in Putnam, but originally in Dutchess, and it's called Tonetta Lake or Tones Pond. It's thought to be named, there's actually a bit of evidence for that now, for Anthony Waring, whose nickname was Tone, and his wife Mehetabel. And Waring was a Black Revolutionary War soldier whose enslaver reportedly freed him after his service in the Continental Army. He served under George Washington in the Corps of Sappers and Miners, and he fought at the Battle of Yorktown, which led to the surrender of General Cornwallis and victory. So after the war, he retired to this lake. He rented boats. He may have owned a tavern, and his record of service can be found in military pension records. I want to talk about another person who is really a hero. Benjamin Latimer. He was born free. I got this information, by the way, from Sarah Johnson, who works at Phillips Manor Hall, has written a
Look at this, if I move it out so you can see what the port number is.
Excuse me, what? Okay, I'll continue. So Sarah works at Phillips Manor Hall. She did a wonderful paper on Benjamin Latimer. I'm happy to share that with folks if they want. He was enlisted as a private in the company of Captain Amos Hutchings under the command of Colonel Louis Du Bois when he was a young teenager. Now, Du Bois had served in the French and Indian War. He was living in Dutchess County when he was asked to raise a regiment in 1776. And Du Bois wrote to George Washington from Poughkeepsie explaining how hard it was to recruit, which is maybe why he accepted Benjamin Latimer, who was a young teenager and also of African descent. So according to Latimer's pension records, they note that he fought in the Battle of Harlem Heights, which the Patriots won, the Battle of White Plains, which the Patriots lost. He then became sick and he returned home, which was at the time in Marlborough in Ulster County. on the west side. I think it's in Ulster County, on the west side of the Hudson. On recovery, he rejoined the Continental Army. He then fought and was captured by the British during the Battle of Fort Montgomery. He ended up in Kingsbridge, which is now the Bronx, and Fort Washington, which is now Upper Manhattan. But now he had been enslaved to the British. And he was finally recaptured by the Continental Army and sent back to Colonel Du Bois's regiment in Connecticut. He went on to fight in a number of battles across New York State, which we could do an entire presentation on itself. And he ended up in Tioga, where he was discharged at the age of only 18 in 1780 after 3 years of service. He then moved to Poughkeepsie and then to Albany, where he became a leading Black abolitionist in Albany, was engaged with the Underground Railroad, was engaged with a bunch of Black institution building activities. And he had many accomplishments to his name. And after reading this, I said, what an American hero. Why don't we know more about him? We should all be learning about this guy in school. What an inspiration. So I just wanted to share that with you. And like I said, I'd be happy to share a link to this really wonderful essay. Okay, so we're getting at the end here. The unfinished revolution. After the war, the fight for freedom continues. So the war was over, but still the fight for emancipation and abolition in Dutchess County and throughout New York State was happening. Enslaved people continued to keep seeking freedom by running away. Quakers continued their efforts to improve the lives of the people and families they had formerly enslaved. And the growing population of free Black people began to build communities that would sustain them. Finally, in 1799, after several failed attempts, the New York legislature passed the first major gradual abolition law. It said that all children born after July 4th, 1799 would be free, although they had to continue to serve the enslavers of their mothers until they became adults. Those born before that remained legally enslaved, but it wasn't until 1827 that all enslaved people became free, although many of the children remained in forced servitude until they became adults. But that is a topic that we'll have some time to talk about, because next year in 2027 is the bicentennial of New York abolition. And I hope that we'll have a lot of time to talk about and commemorate this very important part of New York history. And with that, I end my presentation and I will stop screen sharing.
Excellent. Open up for questions. Are there any questions? I see a hand, Cynthia.
Yes. Yes, I just wanted to thank Laura for the shout out for the work I did for the historic structures report, which has a section on anti-slavery in Dutchess County, and particularly how the people at the Creek meeting were, of course, at that time part of 9 partners. So I appreciated that very, very much. I also just wanted to mention that it's important to remember that during this period, up until I think it was 1822, Hyde Park was part of Clinton. So I think that's why you saw so many enslaved people in Clinton, because they were working along the river in Hyde Park.
Oh, thank you so much, Cynthia. That makes absolute sense. I could not figure it out, but now I know. Thank you.
And I also wanted to say another shout out for Sarah Groening-Sauter, who is coming to speak for us in May. I loved her book also, and read read it and heard her speech over at 9 Partners. So it's a wonderful way these circles are coming together. And thank you.
Again, we want to thank you, Laura, very much for your great presentation, very timely for Black History Month. And want to thank all those who attended this evening, and we will look forward to seeing you on our future presentations, which you will hear about on our website. Anything else, Cynthia?
Well, I just noticed that there was a little message from Stacy Whitaker thanking Laura, which is nice to see. And I just want to personally thank her because this is a topic that I've learned a lot, and I'm looking forward to getting the book on the on the list of, she said, in defiance, Runaways.
Oh, yes, absolutely. I'm happy to share some of that with you and also some of these other articles. It's a lot of new scholarship, and if we can interweave, these names and places and people, I think we're going to learn a real lot.
Yeah, I think it's a topic that we all need to be paying more attention to, particularly as we enter this revolutionary era. So that's great.
I want to thank Jim Metcalf for helping organize this, and especially Kathy McMahon for saving this session this evening. Thank you, Kathy. And with that, we're going to say we'll see you at the next one. Thank you very much.
Thank
Good
you
night.
all.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.